Hello, my name is Linda Clement-Karp. Welcome to the Northwest ADA Center's presentation, ADA Title III and COVID-19 Public Health Mandates, Balancing Non-Discrimination with Public Health and Safety in Businesses During COVID-19. We hope that this presentation will help you navigate the disability-related issues that we're all facing related to face covering policies during COVID-19. I am a woman with short brown hair and a white streak down the middle, wearing a pink and blue shirt, and I'm in my office. On this slide, there is a logo for Northwest ADA Center and a picture of a man wearing a face mask that is green. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into things. Northwest ADA Center is funded by a grant by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. The contents of this presentation should not be taken as an endorsement by NIDLR, by the Administration for Community Living, or by the federal government. And it should also not be considered legal advice. On the next slide, this presentation is meant to serve as guidance only, and as I said, not legal advice. It should not be a substitute. The contents of this presentation is current as of August 14th, 2020, so if you are watching it more than about a week or two after that, you might want to double check if you're looking at any state mandates. So here's a quick outline of what we're going to be doing. Just a little intro to talk about the confusion that we have in this topic, and then the basics of Title III applied to face coverings. Then some frequently asked questions that we're getting here at the Northwest ADA Center. We're getting quite a few questions, so the most frequently asked of those. Part 3 is the specific COVID-19 health mandates in Northwestern states, and then how to check beyond the Northwestern states, and then a little wrap up, the takeaway. And so that's our presentation, and here we go. So cutting through the confusion. We're getting this question a lot. Is it true that I can't ask if someone has a disability and I can be fined by the Department of Justice if I don't let them into my business? The answer is no. Businesses may impose legitimate safety requirements that are necessary for safe operation. And the ADA does not give individuals with disabilities an absolute right to enter a business without a face covering. Now we're going to talk about how we do deliver services to people who cannot wear face coverings, but it's not part of the ADA that a person can enter a business without a face covering. There are cards and flyers that a lot of people have seen that have led to this misinformation. Those cards are fraudulent, and the statements in them are false. You will not be fined $75,000 by the Department of Justice. There is no reporting line that someone's going to go to say you didn't let me into your business without a mask. And so here we go. The Constitution also does not protect people and give them a right to enter a business without a face covering. So when people talk about their constitutional rights being violated, that is not true. It's nowhere in the Constitution. These are on this page, or on this slide rather, there is a picture of the Constitution, We the People, as well as 2 samples of face mask exemption cards, which are fake. One of them says that it's from the Freedom to Breathe agency. They both claim that you'll be fined $75,000 and that under the ADA and HIPAA, the person bearing the card is not required to wear a mask or to disclose the presence of a disability. Well, the ADA doesn't provide protection for people without disabilities. So when someone comes and presents this card and says, you can't ask me if I have a disability, that's actually not 100% true. You can't ask specifics, but you can ask if it's disability or medical related. So that's just wanted to clear that one up right away. We all recognize the image that I've just put up. It says, no shirt, no shoes, no service. We all recognize that, and we all accept it as a health and safety requirement. You don't even think twice, right? Well, interesting fact is that this isn't actually a mandated health and safety regulation, but we're all so used to it that we accept it as if it is. So what is the difference then between that and no face covering, no shirt, no shoes, no service? So another public health and safety requirement, which actually is one, has just been added, and we hopefully will start accepting that. A better way of putting it would be to say no shoes, no shirt, no mask, no entry, because these people are going to be served if they have disabilities and can't wear a mask. And we'll talk about how we're going to serve them in just a minute. So here's the crux of the issue. State and local governments are mandating face coverings in public. And the ADA upholds the rights of people with disabilities to access businesses and their services. But some people who have disabilities are unable, or it's very difficult for them to wear a face covering because of it. So here we have a situation where a public health mandate doesn't replace the ADA, but the ADA also doesn't override public health mandates. And the bottom line is that public health mandates and the ADA must both be considered in these cases. Here's how. Part 1, basics of Title III, applied to face coverings. So in this slide, what is ADA Title III? There's a photograph of a man in a wheelchair at a grocery store. And Title III prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation. That means businesses, nonprofits, and other businesses include like restaurants, department stores, salons, fitness centers, movie theaters, doctors' offices. So that's what Title III does. It protects the rights of people with disabilities to access goods and services. So non-discrimination requirements and reasonable modifications. A public accommodation, a business, shall make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures when the modifications are necessary in order to afford goods, services, privileges, advantages to using that business to individuals with disabilities. What that means is that you make a reasonable modification in your policies, practices, or procedures. So you do that in order to create equal opportunity to participate, equal opportunity to benefit from your services or goods, and the receipt of benefits should be offered in the most integrated setting that is appropriate. Now, all of this is to the greatest extent possible. And the word reasonable is important here. Reasonable modifications in policies, practices, or procedures. And unless a business can demonstrate that making the modifications would fundamentally alter the nature of their goods or services, then accommodations should be made. We'll get into another exception, which would be a direct threat to health and safety. And we'll get into that in a minute. Now, what does full and equal enjoyment means? It means the right to participate and have an equal opportunity to obtain the same results as other people, to the extent that is possible with the accommodations. It doesn't mean that an individual definitely or even maybe achieve an identical result as they would if, or someone without a disability would. Exceptions. Eligibility criteria and safety. When eligibility criteria for participating or entering a business, it can include legitimate safety requirements. So even though generally eligibility criteria for participating or enjoying the benefits of a business should never be designed to exclude people with disabilities, eligibility criteria can include legitimate safety requirements that apply to all people. So that's an exception: a fundamental alteration of goods and services, which we just talked about, and direct threat. We'll talk about that in a second. So eligibility criteria and safety. Businesses shall not create eligibility criteria that screen out or tend to screen out people with disabilities. And as we said before, businesses can create legitimate safety requirements for safe operations. So what does it mean when there's a fundamental alteration of goods or services? An example is probably the best way to put it. Let's say a person is going to a show at a planetarium. Now, the planetarium always has to be dark in order to see the planets projected all around you. And someone who is deaf or hard of hearing comes to the planetarium show and can't see their interpreter, so asks that the lights be turned up. Now, if the lights were turned up, that would affect the entire experience that the planetarium is offering. So it would fundamentally alter the goods and services for everyone, for all patrons. And so what would you do in this instance? Well, you'd offer another reasonable modification, and perhaps an appropriate one would be offering a seat on the aisle with a dim light right in front of the interpreter, or maybe having a script that the narrator is using rather than an interpreter, that the person with the disability could have on a clipboard in front of them with a light, a small light that only lit up the clipboard. And then it wouldn't affect the, it wouldn't create a fundamental alteration to the service, but it would allow the person to enjoy it to the greatest extent. So that's just an example of what that means. So the direct threat exception. A public accommodation doesn't have to permit an individual to participate when that individual poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, being the other people in the business, the public at large. And so only if the risk cannot be eliminated by a modification of policies, practices, or procedures, which is that reasonable modification that we just talked about, or the provision of auxiliary aids or services, which we'll talk about in a bit. That has to do with serving people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And it requires individual assessment. So, what does that mean? Individual assessment of direct threat would be used to consider the balance between the businesses, goods and services, and safety requirements, and the needs to accommodate the person who is entering the business. So the individual disability and how that disability affects that individual has to be considered. It gives an appropriate weight to legitimate concerns, like avoiding exposing others to significant health and safety risks. You use it to consider the nature, duration, and severity of the risk. These are things that you can use in order to figure out, is this a direct threat? And so you consider the duration, severity, and the nature of that risk, the probability that potential injury will occur. That's important because it can't just be a theoretical. And whether a reasonable modification would mitigate or eliminate that risk. So giving appropriate weight to legitimate health and safety concerns, it's an evaluation of whether a reasonable modification can be employed in order to alleviate a direct threat. Now, a direct threat has to be based on reasonable judgment in order to protect people from discrimination. And what does that mean? That means that it is based on the most current medical evidence or the best available objective evidence. So that will help you make those determinations. But what does that mean? And it does seem like every time I ask a question or every time I introduce a topic that it leads to a what does that mean about something else. In our next section, when we get to questions, frequently asked questions, you'll get a better idea of the application of some of these. So what does it mean to use reasonable judgment in order to evaluate direct threat? Here are resources for determining the direct threat. This is what sources for medical knowledge and these are the best available objective evidence, current medical knowledge, or. So the Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes of Health, US Public Health Service, and your state's Department of Health or your state's COVID-19 information site or hub. Those are all objective evaluations of direct threat of the contagion to public health and safety during COVID-19. Now, you have to weigh that against that individual and what their needs are and figure out if there's a reasonable accommodation that can address that. But that's what that means. So on to the next bit. Can you ask someone about their disability? Can you ask, what is your disability? Well, the ADA prohibits unnecessary inquiries into the existence of a disability. And so in most cases, there shouldn't be any requests for documentation or details about their disability based on this general prohibition. So you can ask if if the reason why someone can't wear a mask is medically or disability related. You cannot ask, what is your disability? Or for evidence of that disability. So what would be the exceptions? What would necessary inquiries be? So there are rare instances when documentation might be necessary, and that's based on the scope of the relationship. And what that means is, since very rarely should people ever be able to ever be asked to document anything, in cases where this is absolutely needed, the inquiry should be very narrow. The focus should be extraordinarily limited. People should not be required to document anything in most cases. And the reason why you would use it is to determine the reasonability of the request in order to balance the burden on the person with the disability with the scope of the accommodation and apply that to the service. We're going to get into an example of this. It basically, the biggest thing to remember in this is it has to do with the scope of the relationship, and it applies most often to a long-term relationship rather than a one-time visit to the grocery store. Part 2, yay! So this is where it gets fun, frequently asked questions about face coverings in places of business. First question, what should I do if someone who's not wearing a mask or a face covering wants to enter my business? Well, politely ask them if they're able to wear one. And if the answer is yes, you can ask them if they have one and please put it on. You could offer them a face covering, which is always a good idea. If you are able to have face coverings in your business that you can offer people. You could ask them to please come back with a face covering. You could also suggest that they consider shopping online from their home. If the answer is no, they are not able to wear a face covering, you may ask if they meet the mandate's exception parameters. So what does that mean? That means that if your state or local government has a mandate and it has exceptions for disability or children under the age of 5, for example, does this person meet the exception parameters? Or do they meet the exceptions indicated by the CDC, which would also be disability? So then what? So they're not supposed to come into your business, and but they can't wear a mask, and that's been verified. So what now? So if someone can't wear a face covering because of a disability, do you have to let them into your business without one? The answer is no, you don't. Instead, you can offer that reasonable modification to provide them with options for how they can access the goods and services of your business without having to come in without a face covering. You can engage them in collaborative problem solving, which in other parts of the ADA is referred to as an interactive process, where you come up with some ideas, they come up with some ideas, and you come to a solution. And this will identify the best way to accommodate this customer, assuming that you can. And in most cases, you can. So what are some ways that a business can accommodate a person with a disability who can't wear a mask? So some ideas are, and the most common one is phone and online ordering. A lot of businesses are using that with curbside pickup or delivery and contact-free purchase. Some businesses are using a reserved shopping time where there's no contact between employees and those shopping must maintain social distance. Another idea that I'm very fond of is allowing a video call with an employee where they would be able to actually see what's in that business, and the employee, because the employee is filming it, and then they could say exactly what they need while that employee shops for them. Another option is a clear plastic face shield. Now, in evaluating all of these options, you have to figure out if it works to balance health and safety, and if it might violate any of your state's or local mandates. So face shields particularly are one that aren't, they have not been recommended by the CDC. They haven't been, the CDC has not said that they are useless or anything like that, but the CDC recommends masks. The CDC has not made a recommendation on clear plastic face shields. So that's important to keep in mind, but it is an option that businesses are offering, and some of the businesses offering that option are actually keeping some on hand for customers. So now we get into the really tricky situation, which is what happens if there's no way to accommodate someone with a disability without risking safety or without completely changing the business. So a complete change of the business, that would mean a fundamental alteration. Well, businesses don't have to give a requested modification if that modification would create a direct threat to employees or customers, or if it would fundamentally alter the business, as we said. Here's an example, so that this should help. You've got a hair salon, and all customers have to wear face coverings. A customer comes in who can't wear one, or the customer calls and says, I can't wear one, and they ask for a reasonable modification. They may, in fact, show up at the business without one, and then in which case you go through the identification of whether they can or can't wear a mask. The customer asks for reasonable modification, or you offer how you can accommodate. And so how can you accommodate the customer at a hair salon? Well, here are some ideas. This hair salon owner decided to consider a whole bunch of options and realized that they could definitely offer products to this person, because they sell products, and deliver them curbside with online or phone ordering. So in that way, it would allow the customer to purchase the goods. And in doing this, in doing this assessment, the business owner would be assessing the business constraints and their resources. So they can do curbside delivery of salon products, but what about haircuts? What about coloring? Well, the salon finds it's just not feasible to deliver these services because it would endanger the employee who has to touch the customer. Here's the thought process behind that. The salon owner considers maybe they could rearrange the salon and create 6 feet or more distance between every one of the client's chairs. Well, that would socially distance the clients, but it would not socially distance the stylist who is working on that particular customer. So can't do that. So what about if they chose to cut the person's hair outside? Okay, so sidewalk service. Well, unfortunately, that would mean that they would have to get a new chair that would work outside. They'd have to attain new water sources and probably get permits from conducting business on a sidewalk and permits for the water. Now, the other thing is that this really significantly changes the way that the salon is doing business. And it doesn't eliminate the direct threat to the person who's cutting the hair. So let's say they get super creative and they decide that they want to invent a way to make this work. So they invent a contraption that is 6 feet long scissors. Okay, so now we're really getting into fundamental alteration here, because this is not an inventing business, this is a hairstylist. And so that would be a fundamental alteration. And the conclusion is that there just isn't a reasonable way to safely accommodate the customer's direct service request. So that's an example. It should be very rare, and only the decision can only be come to after going through an assessment of the options and the individual person's case. So we talked about this. Can I ask for proof of someone's disability? Well, the answer is usually not. For one time or a brief contact, it's just not reasonable to expect a person with a disability to carry documentation. There's a photo here of George Costanza's wallet, which he's a character on Seinfeld, and he had this famous wallet. It is completely overstuffed with papers. And so it's just not reasonable for a person to be carrying around documentation. So turning someone away, though, from a store where they might only have a one-time business, that effectively, just because they don't have proof or documentation, that effectively denies them access to those goods and services. Something else that a lot of people are equating this with is that a business, a Title III entity, cannot ask if a service, why an individual has a service dog. what is your disability that you have this service dog? Because it violates unnecessary inquiries that we covered in the first part. So this is an example of necessary inquiry, of unnecessary inquiry, and just that it doesn't, you're not able to do that without violating that. So, but what are the rare instances where documentation might be necessary? Here's one. The rare instance where there's a need for inquiry or documentation, it is based on the scope of the relationship, as we said earlier. And a lot of that has to do with the nature, the intimacy, and the length of time. So here's an example. A child is joining a sports team, and there is an image here of a boy playing soccer, running toward the foreground with a soccer team and one of his teammates behind catching up. And so the child is joining a sports team. This is a close long-term relationship. And by having documentation, the team can determine the best accommodations to offer and be more informed and do a better evaluation of how that long-term relationship is going to work and what the best accommodations they can offer might be. Even in these cases, so if you are watching this and you own a sports league, even in rare instances like this, the scope of the inquiry has to be narrow. It has to be as narrow as possible. And you need to be able to get as much information as you need and know more than that much. Okay. Sometimes face coverings create a communication issue. And this hits us up against effective communication, which is also a requirement of Title III entities. What we're talking about here is people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or who have or who might be neuroatypical or have a language disorder. So you're required as a business to communicate as effectively with people who have disabilities as you do with people who do not have disabilities. How do you do that when everyone's wearing a face mask? A person who is deaf or hard of hearing uses the facial expressions and lips in order to get a better idea of what the communication is. And so how do you deal with that instance? Okay, the method of communication that you're going to use is going to vary from individual to individual. It's going to vary depending on the nature, the length, and the complexity of the communication involved, and the context in which the communication is taking. So here's, we're going to look at it from the point of view of a retail business. For a retail business, the conversation is probably going to be brief, and here are some ways that you can bridge that communication gap with someone for whom masks makes understanding another person challenging. So it's a good idea, no matter what, to use gestures as much as possible. With everybody wearing a mask, the power of a gesture is really, really can't be understated. So use gestures as much as possible. Some other ideas would be, while maintaining a 6 foot or whatever is being required as social distance, to pull down the face covering, that the employee can pull down the face covering to enable the customer to see the lips and facial expression only while talking to that customer from that distance. Another idea is face shields, making them available to your employees so that if a customer with a communication issue arises, they can put on a clear plastic face shield that will enable them to have effective communication with that customer. Also, clear plastic window masks are great for this purpose. And there is a photo on this slide of a young woman wearing one of those face masks with a clear plastic window all around her mouth. And she is very happy and smiling. So she's also using a great deal of facial expression. So those are some ideas. And also paper and pen is good old-fashioned way of communicating for quick communication, and it's perfectly fine. Dry erase board. Make sure that you're using all of the proper sanitation methods if you decide to use paper and pen or a whiteboard. Text messages. There are a huge number of apps as well that people with communication issues use. So you're going to, in this case, also use the reasonable modification of policies process in order to determine what's going to be best for that particular person. So if they have a way of a messaging app that is perfect for them, or some other kind of app that translates for them in a certain way, then that would be the perfect solution. So talking to the person about what they need is vital to making this work. The other idea is that you can use remote video conferencing where no one has to be wearing a mask. So, and they're not in the store. So those are some ideas. Now, every time we talk about an idea, you have to remember that it's all about individual assessment. It's all about balancing the business safety requirements with the rights of the person with a disability. So it's got to be individually assessed. But these are some ideas. They may or may not work for you. That's for you to figure out. So part 3, real quick, public health mandates in the Northwest and then beyond. We're just going to go through our 4-state region real quick. In Washington, the Secretary of Health requires Washingtonians to wear face coverings in public spaces and shared spaces, both indoors and outdoors. And a proclamation from the governor has prohibited businesses from allowing customers to enter their business without a face covering. So anyone who tells you that their little card that they have, the fraudulent card, exempts them from having to wear a mask in the business in Washington State is violating the governor's order. And businesses are encouraged. It says the governor has set it himself to provide alternatives for customers who cannot wear masks. So that means it's a requirement that reasonable modifications of policies and procedures be offered. So there are some exceptions to this order, including people with certain disabilities and health conditions, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and children under the age of 2. Face coverings are encouraged for children age 5 and younger, and all children over 5 have to wear them. Now again, those exceptions and exemptions do not mean that they can enter the business without a mask. It means that you have to provide alternatives. You have to go through the reasonable modification evaluation process. Oregon specifically allows face shields, masks, face shields, and face coverings in all indoor public spaces. They're also required when physical distancing is not possible in outdoor public spaces. Children under the age, or children age 5 and up are required to wear them. And people with a disability or medical condition may request accommodation from the business if they cannot wear one. Everything that I'm talking about right now that has to do with the individual states is directly from their Department of Health or their main hub of coronavirus information. In Idaho, the local governments, the counties and cities and towns have been given the primary role in determining what mandates, if any, regarding face coverings there are going to be. what this means is that Idaho has no state mandate. However, going from city to city or town to town, you're going to discover that there are different requirements depending on where you go. This slide has a contact for how you can look up the different states in Idaho. Or rather, the different regions in Idaho, cities and counties. Alaska does not require the use of masks in public, but they recommend that you wear a mask in public where social distancing is challenging. And different locales, different cities, cities and counties may have their own more restrictive rules about that. They also have some travel restrictions that I think are important for people to know, that if you are planning on traveling to Alaska, that you're probably going to want to check out their site and see what it means to travel there and the hoops that you're going to have to jump through in order to be able to be in Alaska. Finally, every other state in the US, you can connect with their Department of Health in order to find their COVID-19 guidance at usa.gov/state-health. Any of the states, any of the territories, and even a few other countries as well are listed in that site. The takeaway: just some information, resources, and further guidance for you so that you have something afterwards. And a PDF version of this presentation is available. You can download it or print it out, and then you'll have access. The links are included as well. So there's a bunch of resources to know about both federal and state. Of course, the Center for Disease Control, emergency preparedness. We have here at the Northwest ADA Center a fact sheet on respectful interactions on disability language and etiquette. So if your business is trying to come up with the best ways to offer accommodations to people, it might be a great idea to take a look at this and then talk to your employees about how they can institute some of the practices that make communication with people with disabilities more positive and more comfortable. There's also a fact sheet on face coverings in businesses that is on the Northwest ADA website. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of the US, Washington State Coronavirus Response has a business guidance section, and Oregon Health Authority has reopening guideline FIQs that address business questions as well. State by state information, you can go to any of the state's health department in order to find their coronavirus page, and the links are also on here. As I said, there's a place to get anyone in the US. So that is pretty much what we have for you now in terms of information, resources, and hopefully this will help you to be able to navigate running your business and enforcing the public safety and health mandates about face coverings during COVID-19 and accommodating your customers with disabilities who cannot wear masks. If you have questions about anything in this presentation or about anything that's ADA related, the Northwest ADA Center is part of the National ADA National Network. If you call it the 800 number for the ADA National Network, which is 800-949-4232, then you will be connected with the technical assistance line for whatever ADA center serves your region. And we can answer questions about the ADA, not just about how businesses can deal with the mask requirements and also honor the ADA Title III, but about any ADA question that you may have. So that is our presentation, and I hope that it's been useful to you. Again, thank you. Have a great day. Bye.